The story of what happened by Elkhorn Creek in September of 1874 begins not with gunfire, but with the quiet desperation that had settled over the coal-scarred mountains of West Virginia like a shroud of dust. In these hollows, where generations had carved a life from the unforgiving earth, 3 armed men would vanish without a trace. Days later, their bodies would be clawed from the mud of the creek bank, shallow graves that could not conceal the truth of their violent end. Each man bore a fatal wound from a weapon that, by all logic, should have been impossible for their killer to even lift, let alone wield with such deadly precision. The only soul to walk out of that same darkness was a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Weaver. He emerged carrying a Spencer repeating rifle that stood nearly as tall as he did, his clothes torn and stained with a blood that was not his own. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a calm, level thing, a sound utterly alien in a child who had just been orphaned by the very mountains that had raised him. The local authorities, caught between corporate power and a truth too terrible to confront, buried the investigation as quickly as they buried the bodies. But the miners who first stumbled upon those corpses, men accustomed to death in the deep dark of the earth, still speak in hushed tones about the boy's cold, steady eyes. They whisper the 3 words he spoke when the sheriff questioned him about the killings, 3 words that chilled them more than any winter wind. They deserved worse. The case files from that autumn remain sealed in the cobwebbed basement of the Mercer County Courthouse, their decaying pages bound by rotting string. A single notation, scrawled in fading ink, marks the end of the official inquiry, matter resolved by mutual agreement. Further investigation suspended by order of Sheriff W. Thornton. What the sealed files and whispered stories failed to mention was that those 3 dead men were not random drifters or victims of some backwoods feud. They were enforcers, the brutal fist of the Consolidated Coal Company. And with 3 precisely aimed shots, a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Weaver had just declared a one-man war on the most powerful and ruthless corporation in West Virginia. The true horror of this story, however, isn't what happened on that single bloody night by Elkhorn Creek. It's what happened in the months and years that followed, when a child's thirst for a justice the world wouldn't give him transformed an entire region's understanding of fear. The autumn of 1874 found the mountains transformed by an industry that devoured both coal and men with an equal, insatiable hunger. Small, self-sufficient communities that had survived on hunting, farming, and timber for generations now trembled under the constant, percussive thunder of mining equipment. The rumble of coal trains snaked through valleys that had, for centuries, known only the serene symphony of bird song and wind through the pines. The very air had changed. Where once the crisp mountain breeze carried the clean scent of pine and damp earth, it now carried the acrid, metallic tang of coal dust and sulfur, a taste that coated the tongue and stained the lungs of every man, woman, and child who breathed it. The Consolidated Coal Company had purchased vast tracts of land, bringing with them not just the promise of jobs, but a brand of corporate justice that operated far outside the reach of any local law. Company towns sprouted like poisonous mushrooms in clearings carved from ancient forests, their hastily constructed buildings already slumping and groaning, showing the early signs of the subsidence that would eventually swallow entire neighborhoods as the mines beneath them honeycombed the earth. In these isolated hollows, where the nearest sheriff might be a full day's treacherous ride away, the company's security men, known locally with a mixture of fear and contempt as the coal police, served as judge, jury, and, all too often, executioner. They were the arbiters of life for any miner who dared to question the starvation wages, the lethal working conditions, or the company's iron-fisted control over every facet of their existence. These men wore no uniforms and carried no official badges, yet they wielded an authority that was absolute. They decided who could shop at the company store, whose children could attend the company school, and whose family would be cast out into the cold for failing to meet impossible quotas or showing the slightest hint of disloyalty. The coal police were recruited from the dregs of a post-Civil War society. Former Confederate soldiers who found no place in the new America, discharged Union veterans whose wartime experiences had left them dangerously comfortable with violence, and drifters and criminals who discovered that corporate employment offered both protection from the law and unlimited opportunities for cruelty. They resided in a ramshackle boarding house on the outskirts of Beckley, a structure the locals called Devil's Rest, where they spent their off hours consuming rot-gut whiskey and devising new methods of intimidation. Families like the Weavers, who had worked these same mountains for 3 generations, found themselves trapped between the promise of steady wages and the grim reality of indentured servitude. The company paid in scrip, flimsy paper that could only be spent at company stores where prices were deliberately inflated to ensure that workers remained perpetually, hopelessly in debt. Housing was provided in company-owned shacks that leaked in the winter and baked in the summer, with rent automatically deducted from wages that never seemed sufficient to cover even the most basic necessities. Thomas Weaver lived with his father, Samuel, and his older brother, Jacob, in a cabin overlooking Elkhorn Creek, a place his grandfather, Ezekiel, had built after fighting in the War of 1812. The cabin was one of the few remaining independent homesteads in the area, constructed from hand-hewn logs that had weathered 40 years of mountain storms. Inside, the walls were lined with the deer hides and bear skins Ezekiel had taken in the early days, a silent testament to a time before the mining operations had driven most wildlife deep into the untouched wilderness. Samuel Weaver was a man shaped by hard choices and harder circumstances. At 38, his hands were already gnarled and twisted from years of swinging a pickaxe, his lungs permanently scarred from breathing coal dust, his back bent from crawling through tunnels barely tall enough for a child. He had fought for the Union during the Civil War, serving with the 1st West Virginia Volunteer Infantry, and the experience had taught him both the value of disciplined resolve and the terrible, irreversible cost of violence. When he returned home in 1865, he had harbored a simple dream: to resume the quiet life of a mountain farmer. But the arrival of the coal company had made such dreams a fantasy. The morning shift at mine number 7 began before the sun even thought of rising, when the mountain air was so frigid that breath formed crystalline clouds and the ground crunched with frost beneath heavy boots. Samuel would wake Thomas and Jacob with a gentle shake, his voice a low whisper to avoid disturbing neighbors who desperately needed their sleep. Breakfast was almost always cornmeal mush sweetened with molasses, occasionally supplemented with eggs from the family's 3 surviving chickens. The others had long since died from breathing the fine black dust that settled like a death sentence on everything for miles around the mining operations. Jacob, at 17, possessed all the restless energy and quick, defiant temper that Samuel had painstakingly learned to suppress. The boy stood nearly 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and large hands that marked him as his father's son, but his eyes held a fiery spark that worried Samuel deeply. Jacob had started work as a timbersetter 6 months earlier, a dangerous job that required both brute strength and meticulous attention to detail. A single poorly placed support beam could lead to a catastrophic cave-in, burying an entire work crew in an instant. The boy had already seen 3 men die in what were clearly preventable accidents, caused by the company's refusal to purchase adequate safety equipment. When Jacob complained to his supervisor about rotting timbers that groaned and splintered under the mountain's weight, he was told that questioning company procedures was grounds for immediate termination. The conversation had ended with his supervisor, a weasel-faced man named Garrett Mills, making a pointed comment about how easy it would be for a troublemaker to have an accident of his own. Thomas was different from both his father and brother in ways that sometimes made even his own family uneasy. Small for his 12 years, he possessed a quiet, unsettling intelligence that manifested in his ability to read people's intentions and motivations with an almost preternatural accuracy. Where other children played games and chased fireflies, Thomas observed and calculated, noting the subtle patterns in adult behavior that allowed him to predict their actions with disturbing precision. His mother, Mary, had died giving birth to him in the brutal winter of 1862, when medical help was an impossibility and Samuel was away fighting in the war. Thomas had been raised primarily by his grandfather Ezekiel, a man whose own experiences fighting in the War of 1812 and surviving decades of frontier life had forged in him a core belief: the world was a place where weakness invited destruction. Under Ezekiel's tutelage, Thomas had learned to hunt, to track, and to shoot with a proficiency that stunned even experienced woodsmen. The rifle Thomas carried was a .44 caliber Spencer repeating rifle, one of the most advanced weapons of its era. Ezekiel had acquired it from a dying Union soldier during the retreat from Richmond, and he had maintained it in perfect working condition. The weapon held 7 rounds in its tubular magazine and could be fired as quickly as the operator could work the lever action, a rate of fire that gave a skilled marksman an overwhelming advantage. But Thomas's education had extended far beyond marksmanship. Ezekiel had taught him to move like a ghost through the dense forest, to read tracks and signs that revealed the passage of both animals and men, to find water and shelter in the harshest wilderness, and most importantly, to think like a predator when circumstances demanded it. The old man had lived through times when survival depended on being more dangerous than the dangers that surrounded you, and he had passed those lessons to his grandson with a thoroughness that would have horrified more civilized observers. By September 1874, tensions between the miners and the Consolidated Coal Company had reached a breaking point. Wages had been cut twice that summer, while the company store raised prices on flour, bacon, and kerosene, trapping families in a spiral of debt that grew deeper with each passing month. Children were going to bed with the gnawing ache of hunger in their bellies, while company executives lived in opulent mansions built with profits extracted from the blood, sweat, and shortened lives of mountain families. Safety conditions had deteriorated so badly that cave-ins were a near weekly occurrence. Yet any miner who refused to work in an obviously dangerous section was immediately blacklisted and often run out of town by the coal police. The company's attitude was brutally simple: workers were replaceable, coal was not. The trouble that would ultimately lead to 3 graves beside Elkhorn Creek began on September 15th. That morning, as Samuel Weaver descended into the suffocating darkness of Mine No. 7 for what would be his final shift, he carried with him a petition. The document, written in Samuel's careful hand, detailed specific safety violations: rotting timber supports, inadequate ventilation systems, and faulty equipment. Most damningly, it named supervisors who had threatened men for questioning safety. 47 miners had signed it, each man knowing he was risking his livelihood, and possibly his life. Samuel's plan was to present the petition to the mine foreman, Augustus Blackwood, during the shift change, hoping the presence of witnesses would prevent immediate violence. What Samuel didn't know was that one of the signatories, a desperate man named Henry Caldwell whose daughter was sick, was a company informant. By the time Samuel entered the mine, Blackwood already knew about the petition and had alerted the coal police. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Samuel presented the document with quiet dignity. Blackwood listened, his pale eyes fixed on Samuel's face, then tore the petition to shreds. "I want every man who signed this paper to report to my office after the shift ends," Blackwood announced, his voice echoing in the sudden, tense silence. Samuel understood. A meeting in Blackwood's office was a death sentence. That evening, as the family ate a meager dinner of cornbread, beans, and a rabbit Thomas had hunted, the sound of approaching horses shattered the quiet. The deliberate, unhurried pace of their hoofbeats announced visitors who knew their quarry had nowhere to run. Samuel moved to the window and saw them: Marcus Finch, Dale Hutchinson, and James Crawford, the triumvirate of violence that enforced the company's will. Marcus Finch was their leader, a former Confederate officer with eyes like chips of winter ice. Dale Hutchinson was the brute, a massive man who reveled in the fear he caused. James Crawford was the most dangerous, an unremarkable man who concealed a complete absence of empathy, a killer who viewed violence as just another tool. Finch, with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being feared, informed Samuel that his employment was terminated and his family had 30 days to vacate the land. The claim was a lie, but it was a lie backed by guns. Jacob, young and hot-tempered, made the mistake of asking about compensation. Hutchinson's response was a swift, brutal backhand that sent the 17-year-old sprawling. As Samuel moved to help his son, Crawford drew a nickel-plated Remington and pressed its cold barrel against Samuel's temple. "You seem to have forgotten who runs these mountains, Weaver," Crawford whispered. "Maybe it's time you and your boy learned some respect." What happened next would be seared into Thomas Weaver's memory forever. As his father stood frozen and his brother lay bleeding, the 3 men discussed their fate as if planning a business transaction. Finch suggested they simply disappear. Hutchinson preferred a public hanging. Crawford, ever practical, proposed taking them deep into the mountains and burying them where they'd never be found. Thomas, sitting silently in the corner, watched as they forced his father and brother outside at gunpoint. Through the grimy window, he saw them being marched toward the tree-line. Finch carried a length of hemp rope. Crawford had a shovel. The boy knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his family would not be returning. But Thomas Weaver was not the helpless child the coal police assumed him to be. As the voices of the 3 men faded into the forest, Thomas moved with a quiet efficiency his grandfather had drilled into him. From its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard, the Spencer rifle emerged, along with a leather pouch containing 47 rounds of .44 caliber ammunition. The weapon felt like an extension of his own body. Tonight, he was not hunting deer. He was stalking the most dangerous game the mountains had to offer. Men who had made the fatal mistake of believing a 12-year-old boy posed no threat. The darkness, which the coal police saw as their ally, was in fact Thomas's greatest advantage. He knew every deer trail, every fallen log, every rocky outcropping. Most importantly, he understood the first rule of any fight. Ensure your enemy doesn't realize they're in one until it's too late. He moved parallel to their path, his bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. He anticipated their destination, Hangman's Hollow, a small, secluded clearing that offered privacy for their intended work. Thomas reached the edge of the clearing first, positioning himself on a rocky ledge that overlooked the scene, concealed behind a screen of mountain laurel. He lay motionless, the Spencer resting on a natural depression in the rock, his breathing slow and even. When the four figures emerged into the clearing, Samuel and Jacob were bound and stumbling. Finch ordered them to their knees while Crawford began to dig. The first shot came without warning. The crack of the rifle was like a thunderclap, and the .44 caliber bullet took Marcus Finch in the center of his chest, slamming him backward into the creek. Hutchinson and Crawford dove for cover, shouting curses into the darkness, but Thomas had already moved. The Spencer's lever action was a blur of motion: eject, chamber, aim, fire. The entire cycle took less than 3 seconds. The second bullet found Dale Hutchinson as he tried to use Jacob as a human shield, passing through his skull. Crawford, now alone and panicking, made a desperate run for the treeline. The final shot was the most difficult, a running target in near total darkness. But his grandfather had taught him to hunt fleeing deer. The third bullet caught Crawford between the shoulder blades, driving him face-first into the muddy bank. In the ringing silence that followed, broken only by the gurgle of the creek, Thomas emerged from the forest like a ghost, the rifle held casually in his small hands. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice steady as he knelt to cut his father's bonds. Samuel could only stare, his hands shaking, at the son who had just become a killer to save him. "They were going to kill you," Thomas said, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. "I couldn't let that happen." But the true horror was yet to be revealed. As his father and brother struggled to comprehend what had happened, they realized Thomas had not acted on impulse. The ambush spot, the escape routes, the timing of the shots, it had all been planned, rehearsed for months. He had known, with chilling certainty, that the company would eventually come for them. The only surprise was that they had waited so long. The plan they devised in those desperate hours was Samuel's, but it was Thomas who refined it with a frightening understanding of human psychology. The 3 coal police would be buried. Samuel and Jacob would stage their own deaths and flee, starting new lives under assumed names. Thomas, the sole survivor, would stay behind, armed with a carefully crafted story. The burial took most of the night. Thomas, serving as lookout, offered practical advice on soil composition and drainage that revealed an unsettling familiarity with concealing bodies. As dawn approached, Samuel took his son aside. "Remember that we love you," he said, his voice breaking. "Remember that what we are doing is necessary. And remember that someday, you'll have the power to make sure this never happens again." Thomas nodded, his dark eyes holding an understanding that went far beyond his years. He had already begun to formulate plans his father couldn't possibly imagine. When hunters found him 3 days later, Thomas was the perfect picture of a traumatized victim. The blood on his clothes, he explained, was from trying to help his father. The tears in his garments were from fleeing through the forest. His eerie calm was attributed to shock. Sheriff Thornton, a man who survived by knowing when not to look too closely, accepted the story. The official report concluded that the Weavers and the coal police had killed each other in a dispute, with Thomas as the sole, tragic survivor. The Consolidated Coal Company, eager to avoid a scandal, quietly closed the matter. They saw the death of 3 enforcers as a regrettable but acceptable loss. What they failed to understand was that Thomas Weaver interpreted their silence not as wisdom, but as weakness. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in these West Virginia mountains intensifies. If this story is sending a chill down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our channel, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Let's discover together what happens next in the chilling tale of Thomas Weaver. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came a series of accidents that began to reshape the balance of power. Company supervisors known for their brutality suffered mysterious falls down mine shafts. A store manager who had gouged families with inflated prices was found dead in his home, the victim of an apparent robbery that left all the money untouched. The truth began to claw its way into the light in February of 1876, when Sheriff Thornton received an urgent message from Dr. Marcus Henley, the company physician. 3 more company men were dead, each under circumstances that were initially plausible but revealed a disturbing pattern. Garrett Mills, the supervisor who had threatened Jacob, had pitched forward into a mine shaft as if struck by an invisible hand. Vernon Polk, the store manager, had died of a supposed heart attack, but the coroner found a tiny puncture wound behind his ear, as if from a surgically inserted needle. The most troubling was Augustus Blackwood, the foreman who had torn up Samuel's petition. He was found in his home, seated at his kitchen table, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. There were no signs of violence. He had, it seemed, been literally scared to death. Dr. Henley's message contained one final, chilling detail. In the pocket of each victim, a small, folded piece of paper had been found. On it was a single word, written in a child's careful script: justice. That afternoon, Thornton rode alone into the mountains. He followed a thin trail of smoke to a secluded valley, and what he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The boy had constructed a training camp. There were elaborate target ranges, obstacle courses, and detailed maps of every company facility in the region. Wooden figures, carved with disturbing anatomical correctness, were positioned at various distances, marked with notations about vital organs and arterial pathways. Some targets were mounted on pulley systems, designed to simulate moving prey. Most chilling of all was a detailed journal documenting the daily routines, habits, weaknesses, and fears of every key company employee. When Thomas emerged from the trees, carrying his Spencer rifle with the casual familiarity of a professional soldier, Thornton faced something that defied categorization. "I've been expecting you, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice flat. Dr. Henley was bound to notice the patterns. "He's more observant than most." The conversation that followed laid bare the scope of Thomas's campaign. He described each killing with the detached professionalism of a military officer. Garrett Mills had caused the deaths of at least 6 miners. Vernon Polk had extorted and starved families. Augustus Blackwood was responsible for a cave-in that had killed Thomas's cousin 2 years earlier. Each man received exactly what he deserved, Thomas explained with frightening calm. Blackwood died of fear, the same fear he used to control others. When Thornton asked how a 13-year-old had acquired such skills, Thomas's answer revealed the true horror of what the company's violence had created. His grandfather Ezekiel hadn't just taught him to hunt. He had trained him to be a weapon. "Grandfather always said that sheep produce wolves when they forget how to be sheepdogs," Thomas said, his dark eyes reflecting a wisdom no child should possess. The coal company forgot that mountain people have been killing their enemies for a lot longer than corporations have existed. Thornton asked the question that burned in his mind. Did he feel any remorse? Thomas considered it seriously. "Sheriff, do you feel remorse when you put down a rabid dog?" he asked. "These men were a disease. I didn't murder them. I performed surgery on a sick community." The final confrontation came not with violence, but with a negotiation. Thomas had no intention of simply disappearing. He demanded compensation for the families of dead miners, new safety equipment, and an end to the coal police. "You think this ends with me leaving," Thomas said, his voice carrying an authority that made Thornton's skin crawl. "But I've already taught them something they'll never forget: fear." Terrified, the company agreed. Within weeks, safety equipment appeared, prices dropped, and the coal police vanished. But Thomas had done more. He had compiled a dossier of the company's crimes and sent it to newspapers in Charleston and Washington, sparking investigations the company couldn't buy its way out of. Thomas left for Ohio, and the letters Thornton received over the years told of his gradual transformation into a successful businessman. By 1885, he wielded economic influence like a weapon, investing in railroads and banks, applying pressure with surgical precision to protect workers' interests across 3 states. The miners of West Virginia never knew his name, but they felt his protection for decades. When Thomas died a wealthy philanthropist in 1924, miners in Appalachia reported strange incidents. Supervisors who had been planning to cut safety measures reversed their decisions. A few particularly brutal mine guards simply disappeared. The 3 graves by Elkhorn Creek were discovered in 1915, the bones identified only as unknown casualties of labor violence. What investigators never found was a 4th grave, deeper in the forest, containing the remains of Henry Caldwell, the informant. Thomas had saved him for last. Sheriff Thornton took that secret to his grave, but his journals contained a single, haunting entry. The boy understood something the rest of us never learned. That evil creates its own nemesis. And sometimes, that nemesis wears the face of a child who learned too early that mercy is a luxury the innocent cannot afford. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying transformations happen not in moments of supernatural horror, but in the slow corruption of innocence by systematic cruelty. Thomas Weaver was not born a killer. He was crafted into one by men who never imagined their victims might learn to hunt them in return. What do you think of this story? Could a child really orchestrate such calculated revenge? Or does this tale reveal something darker about what society creates when it abandons its most vulnerable? Leave your comment below with your theories. If you enjoyed this tale, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves a dark mystery. We'll see you in the next video.